Well, it's May 2019 and I'm here with Matt Allen, past Commodore of the CYC, current President of Australian Sailing and a current member of the Australian Olympic Committee. So Matt, welcome. And let's go back to the beginning. Where and when did sailing start for you?
I started sailing on Port Phillip Bay in a Mirrodinghy. My father was a Commodore of a small boating club in Mount Eliza called Canadian Bay, and they were trying to set up sailing to complement the sort of power boating, water skiing, fishing programs of the club. And my brother went sailing one day on the Mirrodinghy, and he was old enough to sort of have other interests, especially a little bit older. There was a lot of attractive girls around the yacht club, and he decided sailing wasn't for him. So I went sailing the next day on the Mirrodinghy, and I guess I was hooked from there. And Pete Inchbold and I sort of just started sailing, with each other and against each other from there, and we were just onwards from there, sailing and seeing some of the bigger boats from Mornington Yacht Club. I always remember coming up quite close to Mark Twain, which is obviously a very famous Sydney to Hobart boat, coming up quite close to it, probably at the age of about 12 or 13, in my Mirrodinghy, and thinking, oh my God, I want to sail something, as hot as that.
And how did you progress into yachts?
Well, Pete Inchbold's father, John bought one of the CY25s, the Peterson quarter tonners.
So Tommy Stevenson built them, didn't he?
Tommy Stevenson
That's right, yeah.
built them in Melbourne,
Mm-hmm.
and so we had one called the Loaded Dog, and so Pete and I went sailing with John and his family, and that was really the start of the sort of bigger boat sailing. Into half tonners, doing Apollo Bay races, starting at sort of 1 o'clock in the morning at the Heads in August. Quite delightful sailing experiences, and quite quickly Pete and I just wanted to just sail in the ocean and do a Sydney to Hobart. Fortunately, my father lived in Launceston, or my grandfather lived in Launceston, and he would go down there and he'd drive us down to Hobart. And in 1976, we saw Ballyhoo come up the Derwent, and we were on the dock, we were on the water watching it finish, on the dock when it docked, and Don Mickleborough invited Pete and I on board to have a look through Ballyhoo, and we were just excited young kids, and probably 14 and 15 years old then, and just wanted to, sail a boat like that. It was quite funny that later on we worked out that my grandfather had operated on Don Mickleborough and was their family doctor, but
did he teach him how to drink, or?
I think my grandfather pieced Don together after a few accidents, but that's another story.
Yeah.
So then the year after, we went down to Hobart and found probably the last boat to leave Hobart that was desperate for crew. Kim Jagger and Vanessa, East Coast 31. And Pete and I spent, I think it was about 9 or 10 days in the East Coast 31, finally getting back to Sydney. And I think the morning in January where we turned left into Sydney Heads and saw Sydney in the middle of January, and Pete and I looked at each other and go, isn't this terrific? And we just fell in love with sailing in the ocean, sailing bigger boats, and Sydney Harbour. And funnily enough, both Pete and I live in Sydney these days.
Yeah. So I think then you did your first Hobart in 1980. Was that right? Tell us about your experience then of the Hobart race and what it meant.
Well, I was desperate to do the first Hobart, and had spent some time up at the CYC in the previous years and bringing boats back from Hobart, and got a position on Barcardi, another famous Sydney to Hobart boat, owned by John Gould at that stage. And it was a great crew, actually. It was some of the people in that crew are still friends, like Huey Halliburton and Willow, Johnny Williams, and Andy Arblaster. And I went for a bit of a crew trial, and I jumped on board, just shorts, t-shirt and Sperry's as you did in those days. And after about 3 hours, the guys were going, it's going to get quite cold tonight. Have you got any other gear? And I said, I thought we were just doing a a 3-hour windward leeward race. And we're doing an overnighter, so I got pretty cold. But yeah, we had a great Hobart. We had the traditional barrel on the foredeck of Barcardi once we got to Hobart, and then it was onwards from there.
Yeah, well, I'll get to some of the Victorian characters a bit later, but Gouldy was certainly one of them. But then I think after that you slowly or quickly got involved with Lou Abrams. Let's talk about that with you and Lou, one of the great men of Australian ocean racing, no doubt about that, Louis.
Yeah, it was after the Admiral's Cup trials in 81. And so Lou missed out in sort of controversial terms by getting into the team.
Did you do the trials with Lou that year?
No, I didn't do it with
Right.
Lou. I did it with Sunburst.
Oh, Ron Young.
Ronnie Young.
Right. Another character.
I think we just nailed last place in the Admiral's Cup trials. Yeah. But Lou and Challenge, the team on Challenge, missed in quite controversial circumstances. I think they were third on the point score, and the selection panel, chaired by Jock Starrick, who became later a very good friend of mine, and was a good friend of Louis', turned over and picked Sid Fisher and Ragamuffin. So quite a few, after the Admiral's Cup trials, quite a few of the crew moved on from Challenge, and I went up to Louis and knew him reasonably well by that stage, and got on the crew, and that was just an amazing experience. A really, really good group of people to sail with, became lifelong friends, and the relationship with Louis was just incredible. I mean, we used to sail on Saturdays and have lunch on Sundays at the club and down at Sandringham.
And that was the Sparkman Stevens boat, wasn't it? The challenge of that era. And then we'll talk about, we stepped forward now to the 83 Hobart race. That must bring some good memories for you.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. We weren't selected for the Southern Cross team for Victoria, and that was also quite controversial. And we came up and did the Double Island race, and I think we got second to one of the British boats. I think it was Yeoman, and the boat was going pretty well, but it always had a bit of an Achilles heel in the really light stuff. So onwards to the Hobart, and we had a really good race into Bass Strait, went quite deep into Bass Strait, and as the breeze clocked round to the left, came out at a hotter angle at a Bass Strait, and had quite a good lead by about St Helens, Bicheno. And then the breeze behind us sort of continued to strengthen, and the fleet closed in on the east coast of Tasmania a little bit. Then we got around Tasman Island, and 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, and guess what? No breeze. So we'd sort of leading the race for a while, and then all of a sudden there were port and starboard nav lights everywhere. Most of the crew had gone down below, and we had like 0 breeze and 3 people on deck. And all of a sudden there was this sort of vein of wind coming across to us. The boat started leaning over, and we had a lot of crew on deck pretty quickly. When we sailed up through Storm Bay and up the Derwent, we really had in those days no idea what had happened to the rest of the fleet. And so we docked, I was the boat captain, so I was sort of cleaning up the boat, and finally the reporters were coming down and interviewing us, although most of the people had had more than a couple of beers by then. And we said, well, what's happened to the rest of the fleet? They said, well, they're all still up there, becalmed. So it just shows you, in any Sydney to Hobart race, you've got to be a little bit lucky, but you've got to be able to put the boat in the right position as well, don't you?
So that was a special victory, I mean, for Victoria and for Louis. I think everyone was delighted for Lou to win that race because, as I said earlier, he'd done so much for yachting and such a popular figure. But it was a good crew aboard, obviously, the challenge for your victory.
Yeah, we had a terrific crew.
Don Lang, was he navigating?
Yeah, Delango was the navigator, and Cole Anderson, and we had really, really good crew, and we had Brandon Kibbe on the mast, Wayne Dixon, or the Rat, on the foredeck, and so and Ox trimming, and we had a really great crew, and great thrill to come back to Sandringham Yacht Club, being the first Victorian boat. I mean, amazing that it had taken from 45 to 83 for a Victorian boat to actually win the Hobart race. So we came back, and banners up at the yacht club,
Fantastic,
and and the party down in Hobart was something to remember.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said earlier, Louis had done so much for yachting, and he joins the Fishers and the Kurtzes, and that put so much into it and gave all of us such great times. It was fantastic for him to win that. But anyway, Louis wasn't satisfied with that. He stepped up to another campaign for another boat, another challenge, didn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, well, really straight after that, he built Challenge 3, which was a Freres design, 43-footer, and out of carbon fibre, built by Toby Richardson, Grimesy, a little bit myself and a few other people. And it was an interesting boat. It was never really, it was probably a development from Neville Crichton's Shockwave. It wasn't an easy boat to sail, and it wasn't particularly quick. And probably one of the first, if not the first, carbon fibre boats built in Australia, in terms of a racing offshore boat.
And were you still working for Louis at that stage as boat captain?
Yeah. Up until about the time we launched it, and then I went on to do other things. But it was an interesting boat. We sailed it hard to get into the Admiral's Cup team.
Of 85. 85 you won selection. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And we had to sail it hard, and we probably had to hike harder than all the other boats. And we perfected jibe peels that you needed to do in some of the the triangular courses in those days. And so we'd spent a lot of time on the boat, and we'd been to the Clipper Cup in '84. We did the '84 Hobart, although we broke 5 frames in the bow of the boat in one wave at about 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And that was there weren't too many boats that got to Hobart in '84.
But it was interesting. I mean, the challenge that you won the Hobart race on was a fractional rig boat. Yeah. And then fractional riggers were really just coming into vogue then in the late 70s and early 80s. Bruce Farr sort of was on top of his game then. But then Louis went to Freres for this challenge we're talking about, and he was a masthead rigger. Yeah. It was interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, I think it was really going back in time a little bit, and the boat was, probably wasn't an easy boat to sail. Probably none of the boats, even the other boats around that time, the Drake's Prayer, they weren't easy boats to sail. They were pretty tricky boats. But clearly you could see that fractional rigs were, becoming dominant in the sport, and in a way we were going, back to something that was probably that worked for Shockwave, but life was moving on, I think.
So off to England for the Admiral's Cup in '85 with Lou on Challenge 3. Challenge 3, was it? Yeah, Challenge 3.
Challenge 3. And
it was a very windy series, and there were a few disastrous moments for you guys, weren't there?
Yeah, gee, it was, well, you were there in Drake's Prayer, but it was windy really every day, wasn't it? It was a beautiful English summer. It never got above about 18 or 19 degrees on a good day, and plenty of wind. And probably that Channel race was, obviously pretty disastrous race for us. We were beating in the Solent. My memory was about 35 knots of breeze. We had, I think, 2 tucks in the main and a number 4.
And wind against tide.
Plenty of wind against tide and massive waves. So we said to Rat, can you go down and tighten the leech line on the jib? The leech was flapping all over the place. So Rat goes down to leeward and pulls the leech line on, and he says, "Is that enough?" In his squawk. And we go, "A little bit more." And he pulls it a little bit more, and the rig falls out. And we said, "Yeah, that's enough, probably." So luckily we had a spare rig, but in those days the boats were, Challenge 3 had hydraulic just about everything. We had a hydraulic main sheet adjustment, we had hydraulic everything. So we had hydraulic fluid, all over the deck, and not many lifelines left after the mast came out. So it was off to replace the mast, and pretty much the chances of the Australian team winning the Admiral's Cup were done and dusted at that point. Yeah,
it was a windy series, all right. But you mentioned the Rat. I mean, some of those characters out of Melbourne, I mean, there was the Rat and the Ox and the Budgie and the Whale and Freddie, and it's amazing characters, weren't they? It came up every year, and you mightn't have seen them for 12 months, but they were always the same. Enjoyed a drink, enjoyed a good time. They're good fellows, weren't they?
Yeah. A great group. And in Melbourne, because the yacht clubs are, the Port Phillip Bay is a big place, and some of the people in Williamstown and Sandringham and Brighton, you often wouldn't see them until maybe December in Sydney or January down in Geelong. So you might have gone the whole year. You waved to them across the water if you didn't sail with them, but you might not have seen some of them for quite a while. So it was always quite a good school once you got up here to the Cruising Yacht Club and the probably hosted by Frizzle more often than not.
No, and as you say, some are still great friends today. But okay, after '85 Admiral's Cup, you went overseas. Is that right? With business or?
Yeah,
pretty much.
I did a few more Hobarts with Halsey on the old Sweet Caroline, and then convinced Halsey to buy Drake's Prayer after the Admiral's Cup. So he came up to see Curtsey and bought Drake's Prayer, and so we sailed that for a little while, and then sailed with Alfie Neat down in Mornington. He had a series.
He was a biscuit maker, wasn't he, Alfie?
Yeah, biscuits and cakes. Susan Day.
That's
Susan
right.
Day.
That's right.
And so he had we convinced him to build an IMS 50 called Morning Mist 3. And
that's right. Yeah.
so this is going into '92, and we got second in every race. Assassin was designed at the same time, same designer, Bruce Farr, for both boats, but we couldn't beat Assassin, and nobody else could beat us. And so we really second in every race, including the Hobart race, and had a lot of joy with that boat. And it was a boat that was quite a nice boat to sail. The next year in '93, well, like a lot of boats, we didn't get to Hobart. We were running out of stanchions. The stanchions were breaking. We had big Gary Skipper at Beam Max. Gary was 6'5" and I don't know how many kilos, but
plenty.
100 plus tax plus GST. And he was a great guy, but we were just running out of options. And then I think it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. It always seems to happen after midnight. Nothing good happens after midnight, as they say. But we came off quite a big wave, and Ross Lloyd and I were pulling up the floorboards and having a look. And Ross Lloyd goes, "Hey mate, there's a crack in one of the frames." And I said, "Oh, Ross, I don't think it is. Actually, it's just a hair in the bilge." He said, "No, it's a crack." I go, "Okay, it's a crack." Turn the boat around, and it was time to be almost first back into Sydney again.
Yeah. And after that, I'm just trying to get to, you were off to Japan at some stage, weren't you, with the business? And
well, I moved to Sydney in '96, and basically sort of didn't really sail for a few years, and then went to Japan in '97. Went over there to run Swiss Bank's operations in Japan, and I was only there for about 9 or 10 months, and Swiss Bank and UBS were merging, and so I got the job of merging the two Swiss banks in Japan, plus also my predecessor had bought a Japanese securities company, and so it was quite an interesting merger because Swiss Bank was sort of quite an American culture. UBS was very Swiss Army, Swiss military type culture, and the Japanese securities company was obviously very Japanese. So you had three very different cultures, and they got an Aussie to try and
massive job
blend the three.
Massive job.
Yeah, it ended up to be the biggest foreign bank in Japan, and balance sheet size it was very large.
So what was your background? Was it accounting background to get into all
I
that?
did business,
right?
And then had built sort of trading systems in Australia, but really managed trading teams. And so in the 80s and 90s, there's obviously a huge growth in public sector debt. The state governments and the federal government were borrowing lots of money, and so we set up a business that was very effective in terms of trading basically government debt and becoming really one of the leading banks in Australia, investment banks doing that, and then sort of broadening that out into corporate debt, mortgage-backed securities, futures, options, foreign exchange, etc.
Any time for sailing over there?
I never went sailing in Japan.
Right.
Went to a few marinas and whatever, but we had two young kids, and the twins were born while we were in Tokyo. So
Okay.
between that and merging three
Imagine.
bands,
Wasn't much
there wasn't
time
much
for
time
yachting.
for
No,
sailing
no.
until the back end, and then I started occasionally coming over to Sydney on QF22 on Friday night, doing a bit of sailing in Sydney, and then going back on QF21 on Sunday night, and it worked out that I could get back to the office by about 8:30 in the morning on Monday. A little bit tired and exhausted, but having had some enjoyable time.
Yeah, but got your sailing in, no doubt.